Every 28 hours, a Black person is murdered by police, security guards, or state-sanctioned vigilantes. 1 in every 5 women will be raped at some point in their life. %90 of the U.S. population has or is experiencing trauma. 8 out of 10 will likely develop post-traumatic stress disorder, better known as PTSD. When I began this project, I needed to make sure that this was actually a need in our field. And so I started off by doing a lot of reading and research, but I also wanted to get the voices of educators from around the world. And I only had a week to collect some data. So I made an anonymous survey using Google Forms. And the people I surveyed were 15 educators, 11 of which taught or teach in the US and 4 of which teach internationally. And of these teachers, 9 of them work in the public schools and 6 of them work in private schools. To be more specific, 1 of them is a general education teacher, 10 of them are ESL teachers, and 4 of them are administrators. 1 holds a doctorate degree, 8 hold masters, and 6 hold bachelors. Their teaching contexts were wonderful because I really wanted to have a display of all the whole range as much as I could of a lot of different contexts and age ranges. And so I was pretty happy to see that when I asked them what teaching experience they have, what years they have experience with, at least 3 of them had experience working with pre-K, 8 K through 5, 5 of them grades 6 through 8, 4 of them grades 9 through 12, and 13 of the 15 worked with adults. I also wanted to see if they were brand new teachers versus veteran teachers. And so I asked them to be specific about for how long have they been teaching. And you'll see 4 of them said they've been teaching between 1 to 3 years. 2 of them said 4 to 6 years. 3 said 7 to 10 years. 4 said 10 to 15 years. And only 2 had more than 16 years experience. Now the big question, is there even a need for this? So I asked them, have you ever experienced or witnessed trauma while teaching? And the majority, 78.5%, had experienced some form of trauma while teaching. So to me, this was a red flag that, yeah, I need to continue this research and see how I can contribute to the field. I asked them, have they ever experienced any kind of training? And 10 out of the 15 said they've never received any form of training whatsoever. And then 3 of them said, well, I heard something at a staff meeting one time. 2 of them said, I went to either a half-day or a full-day workshop. So I thought that was pretty interesting to see that the majority had no training, and yet the majority had experienced trauma while teaching. So I asked them, do you do anything currently to be more trauma sensitive, to create a trauma sensitive environment? And 8 out of the 15 said yes. 6 said no, and 1 person didn't even respond. So I also wanted to see, like, if you said yes, what are you doing? And only 7 could or were willing to share what they were doing with me, and I'll share that later on. But despite all that, all 15 of my participants said they want training of some kind. And so I wanted to be really specific, like what kind of training is feasible, is realistic to offer to teachers? And so the first one being, how about just a conversation about it at a staff meeting? 4 of them said sure. Then I asked, what about a half-day workshop? 7 of them said Then how about a full day? It's dropped a little bit down to 5 people, okay? And what about a multi-day workshop? 3 of them said sure. And then my biggest surprise, 9 out of the 15 participants said they would love training regularly throughout the year. So again, this reinstated the need for this. So then I wanted to know, does this need to be mandatory or can it be optional? Only 2 people said it could be optional, and it really, they went into detail saying that it's really depending on the context they're teaching, and also like if they've already had training, they shouldn't have to do it again. And then the other 13 said yes, absolutely. So knowing that everyone wants training that have taken the survey, I wanted to see, is that even possible for them? Would their administration be open to helping them get this kind of professional development? And 7 of them were about the middle of the road, and 6 of them said, oh yes, absolutely. But I want you to keep in mind that 4 out of 15 of my participants are administrators, so there could be some bias. Supportive services. So most public schools and even a lot of private schools have a counselor of some kind, but a lot of schools are lacking an adjustment counselor, which works specifically with students' behavioral needs and social issues. And so I asked, do you have one of these at your school? And about 65% of them in the red said no. 25% said yeah. And then there was a slight sliver of 7% and said, we have an academic advisor who addresses these issues with our school's counselors. So they work with the counselor, but they don't work with the kid? I'm not sure. Supportive spaces. Mindfulness and calming rooms are becoming popular in the United States. And so I wanted to see how popular out of the 15 that I was able to pull. And 50% of these teachers don't have any kind of room like this. Now, the other 50%, it was pretty mixed on what it did have. One person said, oh yeah, we have that, but it's a Catholic church on the school campus, so that could be quite limiting to the students that could utilize it, especially if they come from a different religious background and may not feel comfortable doing so. The other few percent have some kind of space, and so I wanted to ask, like, well, can anyone use it? Who can use it? How does it get utilized? 3 of the 14 said they were unsure. 2 said they could use it anytime as long as they had a pass. And 1 said it was only open to IEP students. The rest of the participants, the other 10, couldn't tell me how it was used or they didn't have one. To begin exploring how to create a trauma-sensitive learning environment, we first need to understand what trauma is. And to understand trauma, we need to understand stress. So there's some series of definitions we need to go through at first. And I want to read my best definitions to you from my notebook. So basically, stress is anything that requires us to make a big change. Now, let's think about that for a second. I get good news that I got a promotion. That's still stress on the body. It's a happy stress, but it's still stress. I lose someone. That's a negative stress, but it's stress. Anything that causes the body to change is stress, okay? So then when we look at trauma, we often think of horrific events. A lot of people, when I had informal conversations with educators from around the world, they would often think it had to be something very major and extreme. And this isn't necessarily true. Basically, trauma is when stress becomes so overwhelming that we can't process it and we can't move on from it. So traumatic stress is when we hold on to a moment in time or moments in time and we struggle to move past them. Now, often if there's a single moment, we might struggle for some time, and with time or help, we can get through them. But when it becomes an even bigger problem is when that stress isn't processed and it's held inside, and the person goes on living without help, and it can develop into post-traumatic stress disorder, where this includes flashbacks, nightmares, muscle memory of tension and panic, anxiety. So we need to understand that stress causes a change. Traumatic stress, we struggle with getting through it, and then we have PTSD where we just don't get through it when we're stuck. To define a traumatic event defined by David Treleaven is exposure to an actual or life-threatening death, serious injury, or sexual violation. Such exposure can result as directly experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event, or learning that the event occurred to a close friend or family member. This can also arise through repeated or extreme exposure to details of trauma, including the context of one's work. So I want to linger on this quote for a moment with you, because often our students share their stories with their friends. And imagine you have a best friend that's going through something terrible. And all day, every day, for years, you hear about the horrific violence or stories of their life. That can actually cause the listener to become traumatized. Another instance, you are a teacher working in a tough area. You hear and see acts of violence and trauma regularly. Over time, if you don't process through this, it can actually become traumatizing for the teacher. A new term I heard the other day was compassion fatigue. And even though the wording, the term itself was new to me, the idea was very familiar. Basically, compassion fatigue is when we are constantly caring for others and we stop caring for ourselves. We become so wrapped up in caring for others that some of us might stop eating, stop sleeping, stop taking care of ourselves physically and emotionally. Maybe skipping showers or meals, or skipping exercise, you name it, because we're putting all our energy into others. Compassion fatigue is a huge problem amongst educators, and it's something that we need to keep in mind. Something a teacher shared with me at one point was, we can't give from an empty cup. And I love this expression because it's very true. When we care for others, we're always giving. But if we don't take care of ourselves first, we don't have anything to give. We can end up sick and burnt out and questioning why we're in this profession in the first place. So we got to keep in mind to take care of ourselves, to reach out to support or for support with other teachers and administrators, and that we're not alone in this. Children are a lot like this mason jar. They're beautiful, they're open, they're ready to take in lots of information. They're a little reflective. They like to repeat what they see and hear. They're little mirrors. But when trauma affects a child in its brain, it can make learning quite difficult. And school systems typically look at ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And there's 8 on their chart that they look at. So let's say this is our child. He comes into the classroom, he's already got a little in his jar, right? Maybe he woke up on the wrong side of the bed or has a cold that day, whatever. So there's a little bit of distractions already in his jar. But now let's add ACEs to them. So let's say that child also deals with his parents being divorced. All right, and then let's say maybe he's even witnessed a little domestic violence. So maybe this child has 2 ACEs. Or maybe a parent has been incarcerated. Or maybe he's witnessed a death or has just even dealt with a death in his family or friend circle, his community. Or maybe this student has unfortunately dealt with physical violence or sexual violence. Or maybe they are or have experienced homelessness. And what's all too common in our school nowadays, bullying, both in the classroom and virtually online. Now let's take this student and see just how much weight this poor child is carrying, or adult, it could be an adult student. But the point is, the jar, sometimes when they come to you, it's already full, and that can make learning very, very difficult. Their brain is already preoccupied. Their neural pathways are not making connections because they're being interrupted by the water that's already there. So we have to remember this as educators, that not every student is going to come to us in perfect condition with an open jar ready to be filled up. Some students' jars are unfortunately already filled when they arrive to our classroom. And so knowing this and being aware of this, we can start to make efforts to help these students. If you'd like to learn more about ACEs, and I really recommend that you do, there are a ton of resources free online, and one of the websites I found is this site here, and it breaks it down to a very simple, like, what are the ACEs, and talks about how it was a study done in 1995 and looked at kids and what kinds of poor health outcomes are experienced. And in 2011, Minnesota did a phone survey looking to have people just be honest about what ACEs they have in their life. And that's how we have a lot of the data that we're using now. And they came up with these 8 ACEs to focus on. However, everyone can agree that there are definitely some missing, but these are the 8 most common ACEs we see. And these ACEs are seen particularly for ages 0 through age of 18, and their ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. In addition to the experience itself, though, it's important to remember that trauma is not so much based on which one of these bubbles this kid falls into, but more of how they are dealing with the results of that trauma. So we have to remember that sometimes as educators, we aren't lucky enough to find out what is going on at home. Sometimes the kids won't open up to us, or for various reasons, the school didn't tell us something. But even if we don't know what it is that the kid's going through, the fact that the kid's going through something at all is what we need to keep in mind, and seeing their response to how they are dealing with it emotionally or physically, mentally. There's a lot of research and evidence to support that toxic stress over time can cause physical problems. And a lot of the problems that we see most commonly are cancer, diabetes, depression, heart disease, high blood pressure, anxiety disorders, and other problems. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit more about those other problems, particularly in how ACEs affects the brain and our ability to learn. Another website I'd like to share with you is traumasensitiveschools.org. This website has countless resources on how you can think about trauma and what you can do to implement trauma-sensitive learning into your classroom. And there are also a lot of video series, and I want to share just a short clip with you on trauma and how it impacts learning.
And so ability to process and utilize language. Memory, particularly sequential memory, cause effect, if A then B. The ability to develop meaningful chronologies. Think about how we teach critical thinking in ELA. We read a story. Before we get to the end of the story, we say, what do you think is going to happen next? We're asking the child to take information, organize it, and make a reasonable prediction about what might happen next. And whether they get the right answer or not isn't the issue. The issue is, can they utilize this process? Because that is the critical thinking we want to teach them. Mindful, upper brain level mindful, right? Think about a student who's impacted by traumatic experience and can't create these sequential cause-effect chronologies. Let's talk about academic performance, learning process, ability to get work done. And I start here with executive function. Executive function is something we do every day. It's about identifying a goal, creating a plan to accomplish that goal, executing the plan, taking the action, and then stepping back and saying, how'd that work for me? Reviewing that. And if it worked for me, I was able to get that task done in an effective way, as I define effective, then I'm going to remember that process. I'm going to store it away, and the next time I have to do that, I'm going to reach out, grab it, and I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to use it again. And what did I just describe? A remembered cause-effect chronology of goal setting, planning, execution, and review. If I have trouble with sequential memory, if I have trouble with cause-effect, I'm not going to be able to do this. Every time I'm presenting a task, it's going to be like it's the first time I've seen that task.
The average American classroom has 25 students per room. Of these 25 students, 60% of them will have experienced trauma at some point in their life or are experiencing trauma currently. According to ACES, the average classroom has at least 5 students with 1 score of ACES, at least 4 students with a score of 2, and at least 2 students with 3 or more ACEs. As mentioned earlier, 8 out of 10 people will likely develop some form of PTSD during their lifetime. Forms of PTSD include acute, chronic, and complex. Acute, typically arising from one situation, one event. Chronic is when it's happening all the time, so this might be domestic violence, homelessness, bullying, social depression, you name it. And then complex is when you have various types of traumas coming at you all at once or throughout your lifetime and building on each other. So I wanted to look at PTSD a little bit more, and I got this quote from Pat Ogden, and he expresses that trauma is any experience that is stressful enough to leave us feeling helpless, frightened, overwhelmed, or profoundly unsafe. Now that we have an understanding of what trauma is, we need to understand what the signs of trauma are and their connections to flight, fight, or freeze responses. When I did my data collection using the Google Forms survey, I asked the teachers what signs they were familiar with. Many of the signs included things like anxiety, defensiveness, cognitive challenges, fidgeting, emotional suppression, etc., etc. Many of these terms that you see in this image were repeated multiple times through the 15 different participants. So, what is survival mode and what happens when it becomes chronic? These are 3 quotes I pulled from Resilient Learners. The first, when children are exposed to complex or acute trauma, the brain shifts its operation from development to stress response, which can have lasting repercussions. Toxic stress on the brain can actually damage the architecture of the developing brain leading to disrupted circuits and a weakened foundation for future learning and health. The fetal infant and early childhood brain is so sensitive, chronically elevated levels of stress hormones can affect learning, memory, mood, relational skills, and aspects of executive functioning. So I want to linger on the second quote with you for a second. And the important part of this is that it changes the structure of the brain. And when they're talking about those connecting circuits, they're talking about the neural pathways that the brain creates through completing tasks. So when we learn something, a neural connection is made when we complete that learning process. But if we get to a certain point and we don't finish, that connection is never fully made. And so when we go through moments of trauma or toxic stress, we start to develop a connection that tells us that we need to respond in a survival mode. And the next part, the fetal, infant, and early childhood brain, I want to linger on the word fetal. Yes, trauma affects even the fetus. A documentary by the National Geographic showed that under severe stress, mothers that are in a chronic state of survival mode while pregnant, their fetuses would be born and almost all of them had speech delay or speech impediments as well as learning difficulties. So let's look more at survival mode. Survival mode is when we enter the fight, flight, or freeze. And we typically hear fight, flight, or freeze, but we really should be saying flight, fight, or freeze. Because flight is a human's natural first response to a threat to get away from it if we can. And the second is the fight. When we cannot escape, we will often try to fight for our survival. Third is the freeze response. If we cannot flee or fight and become overwhelmed, not knowing what to do, we freeze. So let's think about our ancestors and why this is our natural instinct. So from the beginning of time, survival was more of outrunning bears and tigers, surviving winter storms, things of that nature. So let's say we have a tiger out in the wild. We're sitting and we notice one off in the distance. We're gonna get out of that area. We're gonna flee if we think we can get away without him noticing us. Let's say the tiger does notice us and it's coming at us, or it's immediately in our area where our family or our children are. We're probably gonna try to fight it if we can't flee. Now, let's say freeze response. We're cornered. We have nowhere to go, and you're aware that nothing you do is going to get you out of this situation. You're not going to be able to fight it. And so we freeze like a deer in the headlights. So let's think about behavior and the connection to the survival response. And during many of my informal conversations with educators around the world and the survey participants, the idea and the question came up, is there really even a difference when we think of, is behavior trauma, stress response, or is it a lack of respect or poor parenting? But the question I ask all of you to consider is, can a lack of respect and poor parenting be the result of trauma and stress? So let's look at survival in the classroom. Students respond to their difficult life situation in a variety of ways, often using the classic survival mode, what we just talked about, fight, flight, freeze. So a flight would be withdrawing, fight, acting out, and freeze, going numb. So what do flight behaviors in the classroom look like? We've all seen these. Inability to concentrate, hyper alert, easily startled, self-isolating, avoiding others, panicky, tapping, shaky leg, trouble sitting still, anxiety, skipping class, mentally checking out, daydreaming, constantly leaving the classroom. We see this all the time, asking for hall passes to go see the nurse or the counselor or the bathroom or the water bubbler. Sleeping in class and avoiding eye contact. So flight has a pretty hefty list, and makes sense because flight is the first response. Our second response, the fight behaviors. So in a classroom, we see this as fighting verbally and physically with both the teacher and the classmates, agitation, yelling, defensiveness, acting out. This can be being silly or aggressive, whatever, looking for attention essentially, self-mutilation, and fast escalation of emotions. And then we move to the third response, which is a slightly shorter list. Freeze behaviors. We see this as sweating, unable to speak or act, being silent, refusing to answer, body tension, the blank look or staring off into space, refusal to get needs met. So take a second and think about the behaviors you've seen before. What categories do they fall into? Maybe you have a student in your class right now that's struggling or giving you a hard time. Think, is this a flight, a fight, or a freeze response? I'm reading Kristen Sauer's book right now, accompanied by Pete Hall, Fostering Resilient Learners. And in chapter 2, she gives us the Julie scenario. Julie, a 6th grader at the North School, is creating quite a ruckus in her 3rd period math class today. She came into the room scowling and refused to take any notes or open her book, and the teacher's requests for attention and eye contact are met only with deeper scowls. Julie has typically been disheartened with math, and lately her behavior has been especially negative and uncooperative. As Julie's teacher, what do you do? Now I invite you to think about this scenario and consider if you have a class with a student like Julie, what would you do? Pause the video before I give you some options. So, Kristen Sauer's shows us 5 options that are considered most common responses based off of her personal research and teaching workshops. The first option, offer her one more chance to get started on her work. After that, send her to the classroom next door. Her behavior is disruptive to the other students and must not continue like this. Option 2, invite her to come to your classroom at lunchtime to talk about math, school, or life, or just to eat. Perhaps she'll open up to what's about bothering her. Option 3, send her to the office. You will not tolerate disrespectful behavior in your classroom. If she's not ready to learn, she doesn't need to be here. 4, leave her alone. Focus on your other students who are ready to learn. As long as she's not bothering anyone, she can sit there and scowl. Option 5, call a counselor to arrange a parent meeting. You need to get parents on board as soon as possible. Again, I invite you to pause the video and take a second before I go through each of these options. So here are some of the common thought processes behind each option. And again, these are from Sauer's workshops and research. Option 1. This response demonstrates an expectation that Julie can pull herself together, although you won't extend the opportunity indefinitely. Eventually, you'll have to remove her so that she won't disrupt everyone else's learning. Option 2. This reflects a willingness to connect with Julie, to build a relationship, and to help the person underneath the behaviors. Option 3. This demonstrates a mindset that Julie's behavior requires an immediate disciplinary consequence and that through discipline you can change her behaviors. Option 4. This demonstrates a low expectation of Julie's academic and personal growth and a belief that it isn't worth the time or energy to connect Julie to the learning. Option 5. Call a counselor to arrange a parent meeting. This indicates an understanding that Julie needs more help than you can provide in the classroom setting, and that perhaps someone else, e.g. a counselor or parents, can help you acquire that support. Now you may agree or disagree, but again, notice the research. So what are the most common 2 answers? Most educators that are classically trained choose option 1 or 3. These paths include removal from the class, which may eventually lead to removal from the school via suspension or expulsion. We frequently get into power struggles with students like Julie, demanding their immediate response to our instructions, or else. Perhaps we should ask instead, is this willful disobedience, or could it be the response of a traumatic life event that Julie is struggling with? So what can we do? We may not be able to stop the trauma from happening, but we can give students skills and strategies to manage the intensity through intentional teaching in a safe and a predictable environment. When we look at creating a mindfulness space, a lot of teachers are taking online workshops or a day class here. Some are taking more extensive training than others. And we see this global idea of mindfulness starting to spread across school systems. And particularly in the United States, it's become huge. That being said though, there have been some unfortunate repercussions of teaching mindfulness without understanding the importance of trauma and their connection. A lot of people see mindfulness practice and meditational practices as a cure-all for people, and it's often recommended to students with trauma. However, David Treleaven, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, wrote a book in 2018. He did his dissertation on the unfortunate repercussions that happen or often happen when people with trauma begin meditational or mindfulness practices. And unfortunately, these practices, if they're not taught by people with the proper experience and the proper education and understanding of trauma, they can actually cause more harm than good. They can bring a person that's experiencing trauma or has experienced trauma back to that foreground, right to that moment again. Trauma is stored in our body physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And so when we go into a practice that has a lot of reflection and has us connecting to our physical being, it can bring up the past for us. And so it's important to understand that. And if you are one of these teachers that really enjoy mindfulness practices and meditation, then I urge you to please at least read the article, Mind the Hype, that was done by 15 meditation researchers at Harvard University, stating what some of these repercussions are and how you can avoid them, as well as David's book, which is Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness. And in that he has 64 different exercises of how you can be more mindful of trauma when teaching mindfulness, as well as a lot of great statistics and up-to-date research. It just came out, so I really do recommend it to you if that's something that you bring into the classroom. I had a chance to read David's book, and it's even available on Audible, as well as YouTube has a lot of great little short clips about what he's talking about, as well as he has a website, and he just came out with a podcast that he releases 1 episode per month. So that's a really great resource as well. But I want to share with you some of the quotes that struck me in the beginning that I think would be really useful for educators to allow to just sink into them a little bit. So one of the things that came up was the idea of some people worry when they start to realize what trauma is, that it's not so much the event itself, but how someone struggles with the capability to process that event, and so they carry it on with them. And so when we look at somebody with an extreme event that might have taken place, a lot of the times it can make someone feel like their trauma isn't worthy of being a trauma because it doesn't seem as severe as what happened to so-and-so. And it's not true. It's because it doesn't have to do with the trauma itself. There's nothing that's going to depreciate that other person's trauma, because as long as you recognize it as trauma and that's what they're going through, then that is what matters the most. And we're trying to help our students process. It doesn't matter what happened to them. What matters is how they're handling it now, how they're reacting in the moment. When they sit down at the desk to learn, are they able to be there presently? Are they lashing out with behavioral issues? If you try to hold a mindfulness class with them, do you see signs of distress? These could be excessive sweating, exaggerating startled response, muscle tone, just being really, really tense or really, really lax. To wrap things up, I want to discuss the physical environment as well. We've looked at what trauma is and how to be sensitive around it, but I also want to give a moment to look at how we create a learning environment that is trauma sensitive, whether it be a virtual classroom, a physical classroom, or one of those specialists that travel around the school to different schools or use libraries. The point is, it doesn't matter where you are. What matters is you have an understanding of what trauma is, and you can recognize the signs. We realize that children's behavior is a direct relation to what's going on in their life. Now, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big, but we need to be aware of that, and we need to have action plans in place. Number one, you need to take care of yourself. We talked about you can't give from an empty cup. We need to be fully in control of ourselves to be able to be present and ready to respond to our students. A couple of tools I want to share with you are these 2 pamphlets. They're wonderful, and they're based off of Kristen Sowers and Peter Hall's books, the Fostering Resilient Learners and Relationship, Responsibility, and Regulation. They're basically the quick cheat sheet guides to the massive books, which are wonderful, and I really do recommend you read them. But if you don't have time because you're a teacher, it's okay to grab these to start off with to get some quick advice while starting out the next school year. Or you might be in the middle of it and you're desperate. These are your go-tos. They have lots of resources and tips and ideas and just a bunch of strategies that you can quickly implement the moment you read them. I want to thank you for your time and for watching this video, and I hope that you'll continue my research with me.